Hey guys, so good to be with you again. Of course, it's not in person, which I'm still a little sad about, but I wanted to give you just a brief word from God's Word as we didn't get to continue in the series that we were hoping to teach through at the retreat, but I wanted to give you a couple of thoughts over these next two sessions that hopefully will maybe tie it all together. Of course, we were centering in on this theme and this idea of what it means to be made new. And we started on the first session together, talking all the way back to the beginning of Jesus's public ministry and really the beginning of our relationship with him when he called the disciples and what it means for us to be called as a follower of God and how important it is for us to understand the weight, the depth, and the magnitude of that as it relates to us being made new. That being made new traces its way all the way back to that calling on our lives that Jesus placed on us. And that calling is for all of us. But in this video, I want to share with you something that takes place not at the beginning of Jesus's ministry, but literally at the very end of his ministry. And it's all the way in John chapter 13. So if you have a Bible, I'd encourage you to join me there. And I want to read some verses there to you in just a minute. But as we set the stage, let me give you just a snapshot of what's happening. It's at the end of Jesus's life in public ministry. He's done the healing tour, the preaching tour. He's gathered his disciples, and now we find him in Jerusalem, in an upper room, with the 12, and the last few moments before he goes to the cross. It's here in the upper room that we remember him, breaking the bread and teaching us about taking the cup, and it's in this very ceremonial, highly specific meal they have together that we call the Last Supper, that Jesus pushes back from the table and he gives them a last lesson. Now, of course, in the middle of all this, you can imagine just the weightiness of these words. I mean, these are the last few quiet, uninterrupted moments that Jesus would have with his disciples before the path to the cross. And it's here in John chapter 13, I want you to see these verses. It says this, starting in John chapter 13, verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And during the supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was now going back to God, rose from the supper, laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. In verse 6, it says he came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I'm doing now to you, you do not understand. But afterwards, you're going to understand." Now, this is a familiar story and scene and something that we, talk about it as application points even in everyday life of, man, you need to wash other people's feet. But if you were to take your mind to that moment and imagine yourself being in there in that upper room, you'd have to think of it from a logical perspective and say, it's kind of a bizarre scene. I don't know how many of you have sat around the dining room table at your house or at a boardroom table at your office, and all of a sudden somebody gets up quietly and starts kicking off shoes and washing people's feet. But it's kind of an interesting moment. And what's more than that is what really it kind of begs the question for us is Jesus is completing his ministry, and he takes this last moment with these guys to give them this last lesson. Washing feet, serving. It begs the question for you and me today is this: why this lesson? Why here? And why now? I mean, if you were to think about just the bigger picture of those guys in that room, we already know this, that those guys in that room were guys that were commissioned to be a part of the Great Commission, right? These were the guys that Jesus had charged to take the gospel that they had been shown and shared with by Jesus to the uttermost. I mean, these were the guys that would be the first church planters, the ones who would take the gospel from this region of Galilee and in Israel to every corner of the world. They would face persecution and challenges of leadership and travel. And you would think of all the lessons that Jesus could teach, boy, there could be many. So why this one? I mean, you could say, Jesus, okay, man, of all the lessons, you could have taught them on lessons of leadership. You could have taught them on how to be good communicators. After all, you're going to have to start preaching and teaching. You could have taught them about, church structure and ministry strategies. You could have taught them about persecution and how to deal with hard times and trials, because that was inevitable. But of all the lessons Jesus gives in these final moments, it's a lesson on serving. Why again here? Why now? Was it that Jesus was just kind of going through his mind of all the things that he covered and thought to himself, well, I haven't covered this yet. Let's slide it in before we go? I don't think that's what happened. In fact, I think this was a very strategic moment and a very strategic lesson that Jesus taught. In fact, more than that, I think it was the central lesson of his life, and that one we need to grab a hold of for our lives if we're to understand what it means to be made new and to live made new. You see, this lesson that Jesus was teaching was more than just dirty feet and fresh water. It was a lesson about our hearts and the heart of a person that's made new and what it ought to look like. So if you're there in your Bible, I want to give you just a few thoughts today of what this heart of somebody who is made new looks like. And I'm going to give you 3 simple thoughts. We'll try to blow through it quick. Here's number 1. That the heart of a servant, it begins with attitudes, not actions. See, being made new, sometimes our thoughts always go to, what do I need to do more, and what new habits do I need to display? Nothing wrong with bad habits, but Jesus was always interested in hearts before habits, attitudes before actions. Now go back to the text for a minute. Let's look at the attitude that Jesus possessed and see if it's something that would resonate with us, or at least be one of those things that would prohibit us from serving like he did. It says back in verse 1, before the feast of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world. So there are several things that Jesus knew were taking place in this text. Number 1, he knew that he was leaving. I worked with students for a long time, and I learned this a long time ago, that something happens that 12th grade year of school, and it's something that's called senioritis. Man, it's something we get whether it's our last year of school or maybe after we've put in our 2 weeks notice as a job. It's basically that kind of emotional disease or mental state of senioritis where we just kind of coast to the finish line. But notice what Jesus doesn't do here. He doesn't use his knowing that he's leaving as an opportunity to coast. He's finishing strong. He knew that he was leaving. You go to verse 2 and watch this. It says that he knew that the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas to betray him. He knew he was leaving. He also knew the people around him that he was serving, that one was betraying. It's interesting to me when I think of the heart of somebody being made new, it means this, that sacrifice and service means that we live this out even when people around us don't understand it. Even when people will reject it. Serving somebody in this heart of a servant Jesus displayed was even to this guy that he knew, Judas, was going to turn his back on him. He'd already made plans in his mind, and it didn't slow down Jesus. In other words, that we have this heart of living like Jesus and being the hands and feet to Jesus, of Jesus to other people, even if we know in our heart of hearts that they won't receive it. And maybe they'll even reject us. But you see, it was more about our attitude and our approach than even our actions. Here's the last thing I want you to see, verse 3. It says this, it says, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given him all things to his hands and that he had come from God and was going back to God. In other words, Jesus knew that God was elevating him. He was taking him to this place where he was saying, listen, I'm putting all things under your feet, all authority, man, you have. You're leaving. Simon, or Judas is betraying, and God is elevating Jesus. You're above it all. In other words, Jesus, you don't even have to do this. These opportunities are beneath you. The things that you're doing, these tasks, they're beneath you. But watch the heart of Jesus. He slips out, grabs the towel, grabs the basin, and he begins to serve. It was about heart. I'll never forget my first year. In fact, really, it was my first month being on staff at a church. It was my first job in ministry. My first couple of weeks, I remember the children's pastor came down to my office and called my name. And he said, Knaus, I need you to get up and come with me. And now, this was a great big guy. He was a former NFL lineman, now called into the ministry as a children's pastor, about 6'4", 300-pound man. And anytime he asked you to do something, you just kind of said, yes, sir, right? Well, he said, come with me. And I got up immediately, followed him to our kind of fellowship hall at the church, not knowing what he was about to ask me to do, but I went along. And as we got there that afternoon, it was on a Wednesday, the meal was going to be served later that night before church. And so he starts grabbing tables and chairs and, of course, starts pointing me in the direction to help setting them up with him. And we do this for about 10, 15 minutes, just the two of us, and we're setting up chairs and tables all in this room. And without saying a word, after about 15 minutes, he looks up at me, and all he says is this. He says, Knaus, I want you to remember something. I said, yes, sir. He said, tables and chairs. And I thought, yeah, that's what we're doing, tables and chairs. He said, no, tables and chairs. And after a few minutes, I got what he was saying. He was saying this, that listen, all your days in ministry, you never graduate from doing tables and chairs. In other words, listen, if you're too big to serve, then you're too small to lead. That you always have to have the heart that says, listen, there's nothing beneath me. That's the heart of somebody being made new. That I'll go low so Jesus could be lifted high and seen high in the sight of other people. You see, it was about attitude, not actions. Here's the second thing I want you to see. This heart of being made new and serving people, it focuses on people and not programs. It focuses on people, not a program, not a schedule, not an agenda. Now listen, man, if you're a churchgoer, I hope this is something that refreshes your heart, because in church, well, we got programs on programs, don't we? I mean, we got agendas and schedules and orders of services and ministries and routines and customs. Now keep in mind, Jesus is not against the customs at all. He's not against, having routines and order, but he's saying, listen, I'm elevating people above that. In verse 2, it says, as the evening meal was being prepared. We touched on it earlier, but this evening meal was elaborate. It was something that would have taken time, and it would have had all this symbolism of all the different cups, all the different elements, really taking you through a picture in the history of Israel's journey. And it's in the middle of this, Jesus interrupts it. He stops it, and it says in verse 4, he rose from the supper and he began to wash their feet. I think this would have taken the disciples, shocked them. I think they would have stepped back and went, what on earth is Jesus doing? Because we have an order. We have a program. In fact, the program and the tradition would suggest to you that, man, anytime somebody would host a meal like this and have you in your home, you were required, and it was expected of you, to have a servant there who was assigned to wash people's feet. And if you didn't have a servant, it was up to the host to get it done. So the question is, in this upper room meal, these disciples sitting around, who's going to do it? Whose job in this program is it going to be to wash their feet? I can imagine just kind of the scene as they're sitting back around the table, and one by one, the disciples kind of thinking to themselves, like, man, who's it going to be? I wonder if Andrew thought to himself, well, it's probably one of these other guys. It's certainly not me. I was one of the first disciples called. I can imagine Peter thinking to himself, it definitely ain't going to be me. I'm the guy that walked on water. One of these other clowns needs to do this. Or how about John? John probably thinking, no. I'm one of the inner three. In fact, I was the one he called as his beloved, right? And one by one, I would imagine them thinking to themselves and rationalizing why they shouldn't be the one to step up in the program. And in the quiet of that moment, the master, Jesus, slips out, and begins to take on the role. And really what he's demonstrating to all of us is this. It's about people. Programs are important. Serving in different ministries, incredibly important. Having your schedules and routines, important. But the goal of it all is about people. Being made new, Jesus said, listen, it's really about you being made new. And as you follow Jesus, the goal of our lives is about pointing other people to Jesus. Use programs, but reach people. Focus in on the heart of people. You know what I've come to discover after years of ministry is this. Doing ministry with people is messy. It's not always easy. It's challenging and taxing and stressful. But it's also incredibly rewarding as you watch God change the lives of people. Now think about this imagery for a second as Jesus is washing the disciples' feet, because I think it's the same picture that we ought to have when we think about focusing on people. In order to wash somebody's feet, a couple of things had to happen. First of all, you'd have to get down on your knees. In other words, placing yourself physically beneath somebody else. Listen, serving people means that, you know what? I place my needs, my agenda, and even my status at times beneath other people. You know what else it required? Washing somebody else's feet, it required both hands. You couldn't do it with one hand. You had to be fully committed with everything that you've got. Hey, you want your life to count and make an impact for Jesus? You got to go low and you got to go all in. It's about people, not programs. Here's the last one. I promise you we're done. Man, having a heart of somebody made new means I'm serving to elevate the mission and not myself. My goal at the end of the day is about elevating the mission of God and not my own name. It's interesting in verse 12 because it says this, when Jesus had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place back at the table, he said to them, do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and your teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you shall do just as I have done to you. And truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master. It's interesting to me that Jesus here takes the time to say, listen, I want to show you one last thing. What I did to you, you need to model other people because we're trying to take this thing global, right? What you have, new life in Jesus, I want the whole world to have, and you've got to be on mission. And it really means it comes at the expense of even yourself at times. It's about you being less than and Jesus being greater than. It's about his mission being the focus of your life and placing yourself in the back seat. I don't know about you, but that's hard for me because there's times for me in my life when I think about serving, I kind of want a recognition, you know? If I get home and I kind of help straighten up the house or load the dishwasher for my wife, you know, I kind of want her to notice and tell me you did a good job, because that's part of our nature, isn't it? I want somebody to recognize me. I want them to appreciate me. I want them to value me and my service and my sacrifice. But here's what Jesus is saying. A servant's not greater than the master. And even if nobody else notices, Jesus says, I notice. Even if nobody else praises you, he goes, I'll bless you. It's about elevating the mission of God more than the master. So what does that look like for you? I think about this last illustration and I'm reminded, just as a pastor, I've done a lot of weddings in my day, and maybe you've been to a few, but I've always been blown away just by the wedding ceremony. It's funny to me. I'll get there beforehand, and if I'm performing a wedding, there's always this contrast when you go and visit the groomsmen versus visiting the bridesmaids before the ceremony. You hang out with the guys in the back and make sure everybody's ready to go, and you know, it may be 3 minutes before the service and the guys are half dressed. They're sitting around eating sandwiches and like they got all the time in the world, totally relaxed. Boy, you go into that back room where all those ladies are gathered, and it's like a swarm of bees gathered around this bride, putting on all the finishing touches of, makeup and fixing hair, and it's a freak show. But there's one person that I've never wished that I had the job of, and it's the person of the maid of honor. Boy, she carries the weight of this thing. I mean, from planning to organizing to reducing the stress of the bride, I mean, she's going full tilt, making sure everything's done. Even to the last moment before those doors open and the bride starts making her way down the aisle, the bride's maid, this maid of honor, she's still working. She's getting that last piece of hair looking right. She's fluffing dresses and making sure bouquets, everything's ready for one reason. So when that bride steps out and starts walking down the aisle, and that groom steps over and lays eyes on her for the very first time, he sees her in all her beauty, in all her majesty. Listen to me, guys. That's the picture in the heart that Jesus wants us to have. That being made new means we put ourselves aside. We serve others. We elevate the mission of God. And in every moment, every opportunity, really what we're doing is we're preparing somebody so that when they see Jesus, they don't see us, but they see him and they go, wow, look how amazing he is. I want to challenge you today as you think about this. Man, what are some areas in our own heart that God's calling us to live in this way? To live in such a way that we follow the Master's lesson. Listen, this wasn't a random lesson. It was really the lesson. It was the appetizer to the main course that was coming just a few hours later when he'd be on a cross, saying, listen, my whole life was for you. So that you could meet me, know me, and live for me. And it's in that same posture of our hearts that we serve him. We serve others, and we make much of Jesus. Listen, I hope you have a great day. And I pray that, man, this week, man, just God's word would impact you in a fresh way. See you guys.